Good evening. I'm Pat McKay, and I'm the chair of the North Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're very excited to host our first Conversations About Sex Trafficking webinar for 2021. This is the second webinar in a series, and we hope they are informative and insightful for our community. Tonight's special guest was originally Linda Smith, founder and president of Shared Hope International. Due to circumstances beyond her control, Linda will not be able to be with us tonight. However, we are joined tonight by Sarah Bendtsen, who is the Director for State Legislative Advocacy at Shared Hope International. But first, just a little bit about our organization. I began my journey to learn all I could about human trafficking in 2009. At that time, Alabama, and more specifically North Alabama, did not have anything in place in order to fight these crimes. We lacked even basic knowledge about human trafficking, no state laws, and no infrastructure in our communities to address these crimes. So I started this task force to educate people on what human trafficking is, what it is not, what it looks like, and how large the issue is in our area. Most people don't even realize that sex trafficking is the second largest criminal enterprise in the world, second only behind the sale of drugs. I'm proud to say that the North Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force became an official 501c3 nonprofit organization last year. We did this because we realized that we needed to have this formal nonprofit designation to enable us to do more in our community. Among other projects, our plans are to have these virtual meetings entitled Conversations About Sex Trafficking on a quarterly basis to bring awareness to this issue. So again, tonight we present our first virtual webinar for 2021. I'm delighted that we have a representative from Shared Hope International with us tonight. But before we begin our program, I want to talk a little bit about Shared Hope International and how it came to be. Linda Smith is the founder and president of Shared Hope International. She started the organization in 1998 while she was a US Congresswoman from the state of Washington. She took a trip to India and saw the sexual exploitation and slavery of women and children in the brothel district there. Through Linda's leadership, Shared Hope is bringing together governmental nonprofits and others to work together to combat sex trafficking. They founded the War Against Trafficking Alliance in 2001, coordinating regional and international efforts necessary to combat sex trafficking. In 2003, the Alliance co-sponsored the World Summit with the US State Department, uniting leaders from 114 nations that demonstrated sustained commitment to protect the vulnerable from the sex trade. In 2011, a landmark initiative was implemented to assess every state's laws as they relate to or impact domestic minor sex trafficking. This project, called the Protected Innocence Challenge, is a strategy to comprehensively combat child sex trafficking by identifying gaps in state laws and providing a blueprint for legislative action. You can find out more about Shared Hope International by visiting their website, sharedhopeinternational.org. You will see firsthand what one person's commitment to change can do. For this program, we have prepared some questions for Sarah. But if you have any questions, please put them on our live Facebook feed, and we will try to get them answered for you tonight. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us. Sorry, a little off-camera stuff going on here. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us tonight on such short notice. I could have gone on and on about Shared Hope's accomplishments and services and resources, but I think everyone would rather hear us get some questions answered about human trafficking.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for letting me stand in for Linda today. It's really a pleasure.
It's our pleasure to have you. So let's get started with tonight's program. The first question, since Shared Hope International started in 1998, what do you see as the biggest changes to combat sex trafficking? And is there better understanding of how big a problem it is, or just awareness of what it is?
That's such a great question. And I think you touched on it in terms of what was the genesis for starting the task force that you started, that the landscape has changed so much in a relatively short period of time. Linda speaks so often on the landscape that she was working under in 1998, that it was a matter of bringing attention to the fact that people should care about this, and not because people don't care about children who experience harm, but I think it was just unimaginable that children were being exploited within the US. It felt like an issue that occurred elsewhere, and we should certainly care about it, but prioritizing it under federal law, under state law, was an entirely different matter. And the fact that in 23 years now, since Linda started Shared Hope, we're beyond that conversation. It is so rare that in my day-to-day job, I ever have to convince someone that sex trafficking happens in the US, that sex trafficking happens in every community. I think most people know that. But it's more, I think some of the biggest changes we've seen have to do around who is a victim of child sex trafficking, who is a victim of adult sex trafficking. I think that has grown so enormously, even in the last 5 years, that for so long, I think we were looking for a certain type of victim, a certain type of sex trafficking victimization. And really, I think our understanding of the many forms of sex trafficking, the nuances of sex trafficking, the ways that trauma, presents itself, the way that that impacts our system responses. I mean, what enormous growth we've seen. The fact that 23 years ago, we were struggling to convince people that sex trafficking happened in the US, to now we have such detailed conversations about what does a response look like for this type of survivor from this type of background in this community, and how should that differ from survivors who may have radically different experiences. And that's exciting. I mean, that shows that it's not just a handful of people who are committed to this, but it's countless individuals that, like Linda, have dedicated their life to finding solutions to really complex issues around trafficking.
That's encouraging, so encouraging. Next question. I really love the Protected Innocence Challenge because the graphics of a report card for every state is such a transparent way to show progress on each state's legislative efforts. Can you tell us how that project came to be and why you believe it has been so important in changing minds and laws on combating sex trafficking?
Sure. I'm biased. I really like the Protected Innocence Challenge project too, but that's predominantly my project area that I support. So, in some ways I love it because day to day in my role as Director of State Legislative Advocacy, I'm putting the toolkit to use. I'm working with state lawmakers across the country to address the gaps that we identify through our annual analysis of state law. And that's so helpful. I mean, to be able to provide that resource for free to lawmakers is, I think, an enormous benefit. And the fact that our ultimate goal, as a national organization, we don't have a stake in the game other than wanting to support states in creating a safer community. And so I think being a neutral force in an area of politics and area of policy that sometimes can be challenging to find collaboration and work is helpful. But the genesis of the Protected Innocence Challenge was recognizing that around the same time that you formed the task force, that very few states had any sort of statutory response for addressing the crime. In some ways, I think by then the Trafficking Victims Protection Act had been in place for about 10 years. We were seeing increased responses through the federal system, and yet, when you realize that it's a crisis that occurs in every community, we can't just rely on a federal system of law enforcement and prosecution and services to address this enormous crime. And because of that, we had to look to, okay, so how are our states responding? How are our local communities responding? And it was in 2009, 2010, that after following some research that was commissioned by the U.S. State Department, under Linda's leadership, Shared Hope realized that there was very little in place at the state level. And so no wonder we were struggling to hold offenders accountable, identify survivors, and provide, comprehensive services when there wasn't that basic infrastructure of laws to to really facilitate that response. And so the goal of the Protected Innocence Challenge was to help mobilize state action, that we can have, a really strong federal response, which was growing at that time, but we had to have strong complementary laws at the state level. And so the goal was, one, we wanted every state to develop a child sex trafficking law at a minimum, just to recognize the crime. We wanted to ensure that there was accountability for buyers and traffickers and facilitators, that there was widespread access to strong victim protections, both services, non-criminalization protections, access to justice against their offenders, and then that stakeholders were empowered to identify and respond to this crime. So that was the goal. And at the time, it was a really lofty goal. The fact that there wasn't any child sex trafficking law at the state level, and we had this whole vision for a framework of laws, it's no wonder that in 2011, most states received a failing score. And, the fact that 10 years later, we are seeing radically different scores is really a reflection of the enormous progress that has been made.
Well, I have to say that in 2016, I think we failed in our state. I think we received a D that year, and I was not happy about that. So I can tell you, I was working very hard on that.
Well, and it shows, Pat, and the fact that in what a short time, in 2019, we gave Alabama an A. That's a lot of change in a really short period of time, when our framework under the Protected Innocence Challenge looks at 41 areas of law that are really hard areas of law to legislate. Not everyone's in agreement on how to respond to sex trafficking. There's a lot of, cooks in the kitchen when it comes to developing policy solutions. And so, we have talked about a number of times just how exciting it is and has been to continue to watch states like Alabama pass legislation every single year that recognize that this isn't a one legislative session issue, that we can't just legislate through a single bill. The field is constantly changing. We're not going to capture it all. I think Alabama is a testament to implementing strong laws, monitoring implementation, continuously trying to identify and where are we going wrong with that bill, how can we fix it? And it shows the fact that you have a really strong A grade under the last set of report cards is truly commendable.
Well, thank you. We have worked really hard to get that A, I can assure you. And the next question was specifically to talk about our progress. So you've already touched on that, but I guess the other half of that question is, where do we need to go from here?
Sure. It's a great question, and that it's one that caused us to take a pause in 2018 and contemplate, does an A grade reflect an A in practice? Because there were a lot of states like Alabama that had achieved A's, and yet when we spoke to stakeholders in the field, when we spoke with survivors about their experiences being identified and provided services, we had to take stock of do these two things drive? Does this A grade that we're providing match the experiences that we're hearing from survivors, the challenges that stakeholders are still confronted with? And I think an A does reflect the progress, right? But it doesn't, I don't think an A is never going to mean perfection. And I think those who are working on this day in, day out know that, right? That like, it's not a check the box goal, but it's an accurate reflection of growth. That said, in 2018, as we were starting to realize that there might be a disconnect between the grades that we were giving out and the experiences that some people were having, we were realizing that so much progress had been made in certain areas of law. And this is true for Alabama, and this is true for the country as a whole, that in terms of passing strong laws to hold offenders accountable, there was just tremendous growth. It doesn't mean that it's being implemented perfectly. It doesn't mean that we're catching every exploiter, but the framework is there to be able to support that response. But when it came to victim protections, it was like we even created a graph for it. We were seeing this disconnected growth where as a whole, the nation was like at a high B grade during the last rollout on the framework as a whole. But on victim protections, we were at a very low C, which makes sense then that we're hearing from survivors that their experiences weren't always, the standards that we're setting for ourselves or aren't reaching those standards. And because of that, we started to contemplate, okay, so what change do we want to see? We have had so much great opportunity to support growth, assess growth, and now assess gaps. how can we turn our assessment of gaps into greater policy change? And it's not that we're like, moving the goalpost away, that you achieve an A grade and then we move it further, but it's more to continue to mobilize towards responses that we know we all are striving for. So in terms of opportunities for growth for Alabama, what we would love to see is greater attention to what is arguably some of the most challenging aspects of law, which is ensuring that there are true, clear non-criminalization protections for all minors under state law, ideally youth, ideally adults, that we're not criminalizing victims. But then that there's also a comprehensive statewide service response. And the latter is by far the most challenging work that has to be done in every state, which also makes sense then that we see that disparity in growth, that it's quite easy in comparison to developing a service response to craft criminal laws that hold offenders accountable, especially when we can all agree that they should be held accountable. But trying to create a service response that requires funding, that requires coordination, that involves a number of agencies, a number of systems, that's really hard. And yet that's the difference between a state that is doing really well in terms of victim protections and access to justice for victims, and states that might not be delivering the response that they would like to deliver for survivors. So, and I'm happy to elaborate on some of those, but I don't know if there's questions that are going to come up on like the technicalities of this. So I can
we appreciate the fact that we have made progress, and we're thankful for that. But we do know that we have some things to do, specifically in victims services and that sort of thing. We do have, as of today, 3 small bills being filed to clarify and redefine some things in some existing legislation. So hopefully we'll get those through this year. So
that's great.
I'm excited. But yet there's more to do. So, okay, so next question. What do you see as the biggest misunderstanding on what human trafficking is or what it is not? It's a big one.
It is a big one. There's so many, right? I would say the one, though, that exists in every jurisdiction, in every state that we work in, is oftentimes the misunderstanding that victims of sex trafficking don't always have a trafficker. They don't always have a third-party controller. That sometimes, and there's a survivor I work with who says it so perfectly, that sometimes poverty is the pimp, for lack of better words, that sometimes the circumstances are what are coercive, are what force children and adults into selling commercial sex for survival. And because of that misunderstanding, luckily Alabama is a state that doesn't require the identification of a trafficker or a third-party controller in order to make a finding of victimization when it comes to kids. That if someone is offering or pays to have sex with a minor, that child is a victim of sex trafficking. And that's enormous. That's huge, because we know that kids don't always have traffickers, particularly kids who are experiencing homelessness, housing insecurity, economic disadvantage, where they're selling sex to have shelter over their head or something consistent to eat, that they don't have a trafficker. But then we also know there's circumstances where it's not safe to identify a trafficker, or they don't recognize their exploiter as a trafficker. And so requiring the identification of a trafficker might mean the difference between recognizing victimization and deeming something as consensual, which is really problematic. I think it's especially true when we're talking about older youth and adults as well, that because the laws are structured differently and there does have to be the presence of a third-party controller or a trafficker, that makes it especially tricky when it's circumstances that are driving exploitation. But particularly when it comes to kids, this assumption, even in states that have clarified under state law, but stakeholders might still have that preconceived notion of, well, there has to be a trafficker involved, or else this kid is just selling sex, and there has to be accountability, is hugely problematic. And yet, I think it reflects the fact that it's a type of crime that is ever evolving, right? I mean, how we identified sex trafficking 10 years ago is radically different than how we're trying to identify it now. And the means that are driving exploitation are different, and the places that we're finding exploitation is different. And so, but I do say that's a misconception that we see playing out quite frequently in the courtroom, that there are a number of cases that we're following right now in which even the court recognizes that that someone provided something of material value to the child in exchange for sex, and yet there's a blatant disregard of the victimization. There's a blatant denial that victimization exists, that this was just a kid who was trading sex for something. And that's the difference between accessing protection and care and impacting the lifelong trajectory of that child. And so, I think that there are some states that still need to make a statutory fix, but for the most part, that's an issue that requires a culture change, that requires a greater understanding of the many forms that exploitation can take.
Right. Yes, I agree. So our next question has to do with the darn pandemic that has changed our lives for the last year. How has COVID-19 affected human trafficking in the U.S.?
I'm sure it's what you all are saying, that it unfortunately has not decreased its existence or the demand for, commercial sex. It's just changed into a different form. And it's made it especially challenging, I think, for all the stakeholders that going into 2020, we're feeling really confident about the new practices that they had. And then the whole landscape switched, right? In terms of where we could attempt to prevent sex trafficking, how we could prevent grooming, how we could change the circumstances that children were living in to prevent vulnerabilities that drive exploitation. It felt, I think, in a lot of ways like the rug was, pulled out from under our feet, and you're forced to learn like that because children are being exploited every minute that we're trying to learn.
Absolutely.
I think there's two factors to it. We know that children are spending an increased time online and oftentimes without supervision, not because those who are charged with supervising kids don't care or don't want to, but you have this perfect storm where parents and caregivers are taxed like never before, and they have so many hats that they're wearing. School in a lot of states and a lot of districts has, moved to online. And so you have kids online unsupervised for a really long time. For very long chunks of time. Have traffickers and exploiters who have gotten really smart, who are quick to adapt to circumstances and quick to find ways to identify kids, to identify vulnerabilities, to identify a lack of supervision and exploit that. You also have, circumstances that are, ever increasing that drive vulnerabilities and exploitation. And so you're seeing people who may not have experienced economic disadvantage or poverty before the pandemic confronted with that now and making really awful choices that I would argue aren't choices. It's a pursuit of survival.
Absolutely.
And so it's all of those, right? That we know that it's, in some ways, I fear for what does the end of 2021 and 2022 look like when, the cumulative impact of COVID in terms of its impact on mental health with children, its impact on opportunities, its impact on stability is really going to come to a head. I think now is the time that we have to be thinking about prevention, and that prevention is awareness, absolutely. Prevention, though, is also thinking about how do we impact the circumstances with all of the tools that we have? How do we help to support children and families be healthy in all ways? And
absolutely.
How do we start to identify patterns that might lend towards, my friend is acting really weird in the ways that he's searching the web, and I need to have a conversation with him about why he's looking for imagery that rises to child sexual abuse imagery, or child pornography, as it's commonly called, and starting to think of points of intervention, because it's going to come. I mean, in many ways, it is coming. It's already coming to a head, but I really worry about the ripple effects in the next year and a half to come.
Something I heard week before last, we held our 7th annual Alabama Human Trafficking Summit, which is a day and a half usually of training face to face, but this year it was virtual, 2 half days. And the Alabama Department of Education rolled out the fact that they've been working on curriculum for K through 12, which is just absolutely miraculous. I'm thankful for that from a preventive standpoint. But here's the thing. They said because of COVID, and a lot of the schools administrators are sending out these iPads and or laptops without any controls on them. And some of the children are finding all sorts of things on the websites and the web to look at that they really shouldn't have. So I think that's a big problem with what has been we've faced with COVID.
Yeah, absolutely.
So going on to another question. And you're doing great, by the way. I hope I am, but we'll see.
You're a good team.
Across Alabama, as in any state, there are many different organizations working to raise awareness and provide training about human trafficking. What do you see as a best practice to coordinate all those efforts into a viable, cohesive coalition?
That's another great and really challenging question. It feels like the $1 million question that everyone's trying to figure out.
I know. That's why I put it on here. I need to know this.
For one, I think in some ways collaboration and coordination tend to be buzzwords in the field, and it's hard to define, like, as does an MDT, right? Everyone that is looking for an MDT, and yet you can put that on paper, right? But trying to put that into practice is a whole other beast, especially in COVID times when we know that face-to-face interaction is really helpful. We also know that that can be a barrier. And so in some ways I say, like, seize the moment, because think how many folks you can get in the room when you aren't trying to meet physically. So I think that's huge, is in some ways we're all learning how to shift our communications in a way that's accessible to all people all the time, and use the technology that we have to have really quick communications as needed. I think a coordinated response has proven to be one of the most critical pieces of a really strong anti-trafficking response. One, because it requires us all to be humble. When we realize that we can't do it alone, that myself and one other partner can't do it alone, it causes us to humble, right? And to learn to lean on each other. That
absolutely.
I myself, as an advocacy person, as an attorney, certainly will never have the lens, the experience, the expertise as a service provider. And so it kind of helps you to establish your lane, and then to call on each other when you realize that there's someone who has an expertise that's outside of your lane. And when in my job, I've had such a great pleasure of working really closely with stakeholders in a variety of different jurisdictions and states. And that tends to be like the commonality that in jurisdictions that are feeling really like they're ahead of the crime, they have a really strong coalition in place. So two things on how to do that. I have no idea. I don't think anyone has it figured out in terms of there's this like perfect model that's going to work perfectly in every single state, in every single jurisdiction. Like that doesn't exist. But some of the common themes that I think are necessary is, one, that there is like a coordinating entity. That sometimes we develop MDTs where there's like shared decision-making, there's shared coordination, but having one at the core of that, I think, is really helpful for then coordinating out communications. We've recently heard about the Attorney General's new initiative of an alliance, and I think that's also huge. Having it come from a state agency that has funding and is tasked with having a statewide presence is huge. Regional task forces are instrumental. Local task forces are huge, but having those bridges that kind of bring out that across the state is really helpful, because as you all know, like, this isn't a crime where, if a survivor calls on a Friday, you can be like, and do you mind if we follow up with you on Monday? Like, trafficking survivors are highly mobile. Trafficking offenders are highly mobile. The crime itself evolves. Evidence can disappear and reappear really quickly. And so having that coordination with the goal of it being statewide, that at any moment you can call up and reach a partner in a totally different part of the state and know that person's going to respond, is enormously helpful. I also think having a really strong MOU in place, both on a local level, a regional level, and then a statewide level that is regularly updated, reviewed, and signed on to by all partners, has been incredibly helpful. It can help eliminate some of the frustrations of being collaborative, which there will always be frustrations. There's a lot of personalities in the anti-trafficking field, and trying to eliminate or anticipate some of those challenges by working them out through an MOU, and then following that like the Bible, right? Where you are, if you're tasked with calling this person when this happens and you do it, then you eliminate any of the unintended consequences that can occur by not doing that. And so, some of it is, I don't want to say trial and error, but it is like there are growing pains to the formation of any coalition, of any alliance. But having it well funded, having it supported in a way that can roll out across the state, and then having a really strong MOU has been proven to be quite effective in other states. And then just staying flexible, because God knows, like, flexibility is so key in this field.
Well, especially with these crimes too, and fighting these crimes.
Yeah.
Thank you for your insight on that. I appreciate that. The next question, can you speak about the different organizations that are using the hashtag Save the Children? Are they legitimate in what they're doing, or are there some areas that are not so legitimate? Oh, the look on your face is very telling.
This is such a tough question, in that I think Save the Children has proven to be, I mean, an enormous PR headache for the organization Save the Children based out of the UK, but a really big challenge for the anti-trafficking field in the US for several reasons. On one hand, you have thousands of people who are now aware of a crime that in reality exists, right? And like,
Exactly.
That's incredible. I mean, to now have all of these people who are invested in identifying and finding solutions for addressing child sex trafficking is phenomenal. I mean, that's a gift that I think any of us are so grateful to have in this time when we need all eyes and ears on children and youth in our communities.
Most definitely.
On the other hand, you have this increased concern interwoven with misinformation that I fear is going to have really unintended consequences, in that, in some ways, when I've looked at information that's been shared under hashtag Save the Children, I feel like it's brought us back 20 years. And I want to be like, it doesn't involve chains. Like, it doesn't involve always kidnapping. Like, kids are not, a majority of kids are not being kidnapped by the creepy white man in the van, right? Like,
the white van. It's got to be the white van.
Exactly. The white van, windowless white van. Like,
that's right. That's right.
Sure, there's outlier cases where kids are snatched off the streets. But if that's where we're deciding to focus our attention, then we're going to miss the 99% of kids who are being trafficked from their homes, from their their computers and their phones by someone they perceive to be a boyfriend or a girlfriend, by a parent, who's selling a child. We're going to miss all of that.
It's true. I
also think if our attention is on the people who Save the Children believe are the primary drivers of exploitation, high profile leaders, high profile government officials, celebrities, then we're missing the 99% of people who are actually perpetuating this crime, which is like our family members, our friends, the attorneys in our communities, the pastors in our communities, the judges, and our average day people in our communities are the offenders of child sex trafficking. And we can talk all day long about maybe a celebrity who's maybe doing this, but like, how many of us have access to that celebrity? Like, I can't intervene if like Ellen DeGeneres is apparently selling kids, right? But I can be on the lookout for the people in my life who are viewing abusive imagery of children online, who are having inappropriate conversations about the ways that they perpetuate sexual violence and gender-based violence, and I can intervene in that. So for that reason, we don't use hashtag Save the Children. We don't support information that comes from hashtag Save the Children. I'm sure there is some really credible, great information that's shared, but the fact that it's interwoven with information that we know is just unequivocally untrue, I think risks setting us back as a field. And, we started this conversation talking about all of the growth that we made, that we can't afford to go back 20 years and have a lot of the same conversations that, we were having when we didn't know that sex trafficking existed in our communities. So, but it's tough. I know we've all been confronted with it and are weeding through what's true, what's not true.
Well, we appreciate your organization helping us decipher some of that. So thank you so much for that. Yeah. So another question. There have been many times when an accused trafficker is charged with lesser non-human trafficking crimes just in order to get a conviction and get the trafficker off the street. Since these are still human trafficking related, how do we capture these cases in our data collection systems in order to see a complete picture of what human trafficking activities are going on?
Yeah, that's so true.
It's a problem.
It's a huge problem. And that, despite a lot of recognition in terms of the presence of the crime, the nature of sex trafficking, the desire to prosecute it. I think, talk to any prosecutor and they would love to prosecute a trafficking case if they had all of the resources to do it, that these are really resource intensive cases, it's really hard to develop collaboration with victims who are key to obtaining evidence that's necessary to get a conviction. And then it's just the nature of our criminal justice system, that we are a system built on expediency and efficiency and largely underfunded. And so we do see a lot of plea deals when it comes to trafficking. One, because it helps to move cases through the system. Two, because trafficking cases are really hard to prosecute when you don't have, victims who feel safe to participate in, testifying against the accused, or they themselves have been wrongfully accused, and so they're not even available as victim witnesses in the case. That said, I think there are still really great ways that we can, as we're working towards, getting more trafficking convictions, to still capture the essence of the crime in data. And so some of those ways are collecting underlying charges. So what was the original charge on a petition? I think can help to show, yes, it was charged as trafficking and they pled down to whatever, a felony CSEC offense, but we still know that there was enough evidence at the time of, the initial charge that it amounted to and it rose to sex trafficking. I think that's huge. I think also even looking at and examining the nature of the resulting charge, that I can assume that if a buyer has if there's a conviction for a child sex trafficking or a CSEC offense, a purchasing offense, but it involves a buyer and a minor, well, that's also trafficking, right? So maybe the conviction wasn't for trafficking, but you have an adult who's purchasing sex with a minor, that also rises to sex trafficking. And so starting to tease out some of those facts of the case to build better data systems can help. But I also think collecting data from multiple systems is also key. That collecting data from the criminal justice system in terms of convictions is super helpful, but also collecting data from the child welfare system, from our juvenile justice systems, in terms of, we might not have a convicted trafficker, but we have a minor over here in child welfare who has all of the signs of a child who probably experienced exploitation. And so that together can help paint a fuller picture. We're never going to have perfect data on sex trafficking, just given the nature of the offense. It involves oftentimes unidentified missing victims. It involves, as you've mentioned, buyers who have access to money, who can have private defense counsels who help them solidify a lower, or, to plead down to a lower offense. But the data together can help paint a much more accurate picture of the landscape that we're working in.
I agree wholeheartedly. We're never going to have the data collection that we need. We're never going to have the statistics that we need. One of the first things that I was just trying to find when I suddenly had human trafficking on my heart to do something about. First thing I did was go to all the police departments in this area saying, oh, tell me your stats for this and stats for that. And they laughed at me basically. And I got it. But, we still don't have them. That's 11 and a half years ago. And we don't have those data collection systems that are talking to each other. You would have to go to each department, police department across the state in order to get that.
Exactly.
We've got to do something about that. But that's a whole different conversation about sex trafficking. Last question that I have, unless we get some from the audience, with all the conferences and interactions with individuals, that you have across the U.S., have you seen any practices, programs, legislation, et cetera, that could help us here in Alabama?
Sure. Well, in addition to the collaborative piece, which we talked about, which is hugely instrumental to an effective response, I think the other one that has proven to be the most impactful is really strong, really clear laws that identify victimization. That doesn't, that the law isn't so ambiguous that you're left wondering, okay, so do we have a victim of sex trafficking, or do we have a prostitution offender, or do we have someone who is experiencing exploitation, or someone who is abusing substances? That we have to have really comprehensive non-criminalization laws in order to ensure that we're delivering effective responses. And I will say on the flip side of that, that we're putting our prosecutorial and law enforcement efforts towards holding actual offenders accountable. And so the states that have done that, who have made it so unequivocally clear under the prostitution statute, under the child welfare statutes, that children engaged in commercial sex, regardless of whether an offender is identified, whether an offender is prosecuted, is always a victim of sex trafficking, and never a prostitution offender, never a offender of a child in need of supervision. Some of these alternative punitive responses that we've put in place. I think that is like so fundamental to then building out a really appropriate response for victims. Some of the problems, around more ambiguous non-criminalization laws or safe harbor laws, is the fact that kids still get lost in the system, right? You have some kids over here who were identified as sex trafficking victims. Then you have some kids over here where you're like, there could be some degree of culpability here, but we don't want to call them a prostitution offender, so we're going to call them a child in need of services, and they're still within the juvenile justice system. And then you have some kids in that child welfare system being identified as victims of child abuse or neglect. That's a hard, how do you keep track of all of those responses, right? That in some ways operate in conflict to each other. And so I will say, as we're monitoring, there's no state that has developed a perfect response, but the states that are doing really well in the area of victim protections have ensured that there's a very clear non-criminalization law in place, both for prostitution, but also for other offenses that we know that victims are engaged in because of their victimization. And so expanding non-criminalization laws to ensure that, we're not bringing kids in on status offenses, that, a status offense violation running from home, running from placement, truancy, like that's intrinsic to sex trafficking victimization. Like we can't expect child sex trafficking victims to have regular attendance at school when they're working through horrific trauma or they're still being exploited. And so I think there's that. And then, like we talked about, developing a really strong service response that's available regardless of where in the state a child is identified. And so I think some of that, of course, comes down to the state agencies that are that should be responsible, but it's also empowering our community-based service providers who maybe historically or traditionally were providing services to other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, like sexual assault or domestic or intimate partner violence, that they understand trauma, right? They may not understand all of the nuances of sex trafficking and victimization, but here's a group of advocates who get sexual violence. And so equipped with the right information, the right training, they can be tremendous partners in this effort and can help to fill in some of the service gaps. And we know that's true, that, expecting states to develop a statewide service response is a really daunting task, but being creative in who your partners are and ensuring that there's comprehensive training to equip and empower untraditional partners to be partners is enormously helpful.
We have a couple of questions coming in.
Sure.
Yes, it keeps us going, right?
Yeah.
How much skepticism do you encounter from people who don't think human trafficking is a big problem? That's just an example, by the way.
Yeah, very seldom, but I will say I'm in a bubble. I'm largely providing support to people who are trying to fix this problem. And so I'm working with, I will say there's skepticism over the degree of which sex trafficking occurs. I think there's some people who still believe that it's outlier cases. And so therefore we don't create policy based upon outlier cases of exploitation or abuse. And so trying to demonstrate the ways that exploitation arises, that it might be outlier that kids are being kidnapped off the street and sold by a trafficker, but it's not an outlier that a lot of kids in our community are experiencing poverty and are trading sex for survival. And then the other thing I point to is, I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota right now, and Minnesota conducted the first ever statewide survey of high school age children to survey their responses of whether they had ever traded sex. And it surveyed just 2 grade levels, just 9th and 11th graders on one day. So it doesn't capture all kids who are in the public school system. And they got 5,000 affirmative responses that at some point in time, a child had traded sex for something of value. So whether it was alcohol or substances or food or shelter, that is an enormous amount of kids when you also think about the fact that a lot of exploited kids aren't in school, and that excluded 10th and 12th graders. And so I don't think Minnesota is an anomaly. I think that, sure, the levels are going to vary, but kids in our community who are confronted with choices that they should never have to make are, being coerced to engage in commercial sex in order just to survive. And so I think there's enough examples. There's also been so many brave survivors who have shared their accounts of exploitation that it's quite easily, I would say it's an easy thing to convince someone that exploitation exists. It's a different ball game trying to convince, some stakeholders that this should be a priority.
Sure. Of course, that is one of the big obstacles we all face, no matter what it is. Okay, we have a couple questions. Let me get to it. What would you say is the largest resource gap in survivor support, housing, mental health care, etc.?
All of it, unfortunately, all of it. I will say probably the largest though is long-term support. That there's been a lot of attention towards providing immediate relief, which is so critical, right? I mean, that's the difference between sometimes continued exploitation and access to safety and support. But in some ways, survivors sometimes enter this like desert. Once they're past like the acute crisis stage, then they're kind of on their own. And then they're confronted with some of the same vulnerability factors that may have driven their exploitation in the first place. And so I think it's both a response and it's also prevention. And it's been hard to get funding that is available on a long-term basis for survivors. That housing, yes, we can provide immediate housing for children and families and adult survivors of trafficking, but what does access to housing look like a year afterwards when they no longer need the support and infrastructure of, say, a safe house, or it's no longer appropriate for them? How do they afford rent? How do they afford rent 5 years from now, especially if a survivor has a criminal record? And I think it's working in tandem, right? Like we do still need resources going towards immediate responses and care for people who are newly identified as victims. But then we also need to be thinking about access to long-term support and resources, also to prevent the cycle of exploitation and the cycle of vulnerabilities that we know exist in some communities.
So next question from the audience. What is the next focus that Shared Hope will be working on? You've already done so much, but they want to see where you believe you need to focus next.
Great question.
Trade secrets coming out here.
Exactly. I think we're evaluating this every day. Well, I will say we are a really small but mighty team in that the policy team, there's just 4 of us with a fantastic contractor and a bunch of wonderful law fellows, but we're a small team. And yet I think every single day there's like this question of like, what new project can we take on? Because we're constantly confronted with like all of the challenges that the field still faces and incredible opportunities to do better. And I believe that we can all be doing better. There's always opportunities to do better. But in terms of a formal next step, we in 2018 conducted we launched a 2-year research process to assess the effectiveness of the former Protected Innocence Challenge legal framework, the gaps that existed in the field, the areas that anti-trafficking stakeholders felt should be a priority, to develop an entirely new legislative framework for supporting the next wave of policy reform specific to sex trafficking. And we were so lucky. We had several stakeholders from Alabama who participated in this research process, who came to our in-person work group session convenings, who provided fantastic insights into some of the solutions that had been developed in Alabama, some of the gaps that were still being seen. And with that, we did launch a new 40 component legal framework in November. Some of the components are reminiscent of components that existed under the previous framework, but it's largely centered on supporting legislative change around victim protection. So our previous framework, only 25% of the framework looked at victim protections. This new framework is 75% of it is focused on victim protections. The other thing that we're doing is expanding our framework beyond just child sex trafficking, and we're looking at what protections are available for youth, particularly transition age youth who are aging out of traditional child serving systems. This bright line of 18, I think in some ways has prevented us from preventing exploitation for older youth and adults. And because of that, we need to say, okay, this protection that's available to a 15-year-old should absolutely be available to a 21-year-old. Their cognitive development, they're in a similar stage. The obstacles that they experience as young people are largely the same, and they might even be intensified because they're in that pivotal moment of transitioning from childhood to adulthood, and they need all of the support systems around them. The other thing that we're looking at is the intersection of sex trafficking and labor trafficking and poly-victimization, that we know that sex trafficking victims are, largely impacted by other forms of exploitation or intimate partner violence or sexual assault. And so some of that is we need to ensure that our responses are taking that into account, but it also allows us to expand who our partners are in the field. And so I say that to encourage all of us to be thinking collectively on, absolutely, we should take stock of our progress, and we absolutely have to celebrate that. And Alabama, out of all states, absolutely deserves this, celebration. And then we also are forced and we're responsible for thinking about, and how can we be doing better, and working towards that collectively, that it takes all of us. It takes both a national perspective, it takes a local perspective, and it takes state effort. But we can do it. And, we're already seeing states take the framework that was just launched in November and starting to legislate some of the solutions towards creating a safer climate and environment for children and young people.
Very good. Thank you for that. Let's see, what programs are there for parents to not only identify if their child is being groomed, but to give them actual skills to make their children less targetable, that's a new word, to traffickers?
That is a new word for me too. But I think that it's so true.
We don't want them to be targets.
Yeah, I know, we definitely don't want them to be targets. And yet this is something that I implore every parent to be cognizant of. I am a parent of a really young person, and yet there's ways for me to be talking about, safety and consent. And he's only 2, right? But he gets it that, he should ask before he hugs someone. And likewise, that someone, before someone touches him, he has opportunity to say no. And so I think regardless of how old your child is, there are ways that we can be thinking about safety. And unfortunately, the circumstances that we hope our child will never be confronted with. That said, Shared Hope also, largely in response to the increased presence of exploitation online, launched an internet safety series that was just for this. It's for parents, caregivers, teachers who are trying to keep kids, safe during an especially trying time. And that's a resource that's free. It's accessible to anyone. It's not the only solution. There's a lot of people who have created wonderful materials during this time that, empower instead of scare parents. Because I think that's the other thing. When something feels really scary, I, for myself, kind of shut down, right? I don't even want to think about what it could look like if someone was targeting my child. But if I feel empowered to prevent it, well, then heck, I'm going to do everything I can to educate myself. And that's our goal, is to provide access to information that can, keep up to speed on even what apps are out there. I have absolutely no idea what apps young people are using. And so luckily, some of my lovely younger colleagues who are more up to speed on this are aware and are following it and are updating our online internet safety series information so that you have the most up-to-date information that you need.
That's great. The internet has certainly taken over for everyone. And we do try to, at our yearly summit in Montgomery, which we did week before last, we try to have something about cyber safety, internet safety for the parents. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, the State Department of Education has rolled out some new curriculum for the K through 12 schools and children. One of the things they also have on their website is a parent section, and then there's a community section, which I'm really proud of because I wrote that. Actually, they took it from our state task force website, so I was very excited.
Wow,
but the fact that parents can go to the same website as a part of their parent teacher organization or whatever it is now. It used to be PTA, now it's PTO. But they can get trained on it as well and get answers to questions that are very normal to parents for the safety of their kids. So
Absolutely.
if
Oh,
we've
that's
got
fantastic.
anything, I don't think we have anything else, and we're about 5 minutes out from our end time. Is there anything else you would like to say?
I don't think so, either than, you know, when I knew Linda was supposed to be being with you all tonight, and when she joined the summit last week, I was just, it allowed me the opportunity to reflect back on some of the fantastic pieces of legislation that I've seen come through Alabama, and the insights I've, you know, been privy to because of some of our partners in the field. And I'm really excited about what your state is doing. And I appreciate the willingness to chip away at it, you know, month by month, year by year, and truly committed to sustainable progress. I think that's so huge. And I've enjoyed every person I've ever worked with in Alabama, and really am impressed by what's been developed in your state. And oftentimes I share Alabama statutes, you know, some of the policies that have been written with stakeholders from other states. And it's been enormously, you know, helpful for other state stakeholders as well. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here, and letting me be a part
appreciate you
of
being here. Thank you.
progress.
And thank you for the nice compliments about Alabama. You know, Alabama is usually number 49 or number 50 in this country. So to get this wonderful compliment, we appreciate it very much. Thank you. So I guess our time is up. We're really close to 8 o'clock, and we were going to stay with an hour. The North Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force will present another webinar in this series during the next quarter. So be watching for that announcement, folks. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us and sharing your expertise. What an informative evening I think we've had. We really appreciate you being with us tonight on such short notice, and thank you so much. You've been wonderful to talk with. I also want to thank the task force board members, Pam, Bo, Rick, and Deborah, who worked behind the scenes to make this webinar happen. And to all of you, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. If you would like, please go to our Facebook page and make a donation to the North Alabama Human Trafficking Task Force. Your donations will go a long way to help fund future awareness activities, educational events such as these webinars, and other future projects. So thank you, everyone, for all that you do and for joining us tonight. Good night.